This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Mark Schofield, Plantlife's Road Verge Advisor for the UK. Mark has a huge amount of experience when it comes to green space conservation and is currently involved in a number of projects across the country to manage road verges better for wildlife. He's also one of Plantlife's representatives for the Mow May campaign. And in this interview, he talks about how we can maintain both private and public green spaces more sympathetically for wildflowers and the wildlife they support.
Plantlife is an international organisation and we're active in international conservation activity. We've been part of the designation of important plant areas across the world. We attended Montreal, the last COP19 Convention of Biodiversity, and we're active nationally too. And some priorities for what we do are what some people may never have heard of, but temperate rainforests are a real rarity and something that we in the British Isles are especially good at supporting as a habitat. And they're restricted to the north, the west, the cooler, moister climate, but areas that are buffered from frost by the influence of the sea. So yes, that's a priority for us. And we're also really keen to support species that are on the edge of local and sometimes national extinction. And that's part of the drive behind what we do too. But another priority for us is grassland conservation. And you may have heard that grassland is having a bit of a rough time. An often quoted statistic about grassland is that over 97% of lowland wildflower-rich grassland has been lost across England and Wales since the 1930s. And that's all part of this loss over the last 50 years of more than a half of our flowering plant species where they used to grow, in the areas where they used to grow in the UK. And that's left grasslands, considered by the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland in their report only last year, grasslands to be among the most threatened habitats in Britain. And it's not just about the plants, of course, it's about the rest of the wildlife that they support. And that includes our flying insect population, which has declined, it's now thought, by as much as 60% in the last 20 years, according to results that came from BugLife a couple of years back, just from counting the number of splats on car registration plates. But that includes a sorry story that we learned from butterfly conservation, that since the 1970s, there's been a drop in the abundance of butterflies by a sixth, and moths have declined in abundance by a quarter, and that's since the 70s alone. So let's not forget the importance pollinators provide for us. That's over £600 million a year in value for the UK's agriculture. So we should really be worrying economically about the loss of our pollinators and the implications that have for our food security and for food prices too.
If anybody's not terrified by those figures, then I'm not quite sure why. But obviously there's a lot being done to mitigate this loss. And one of those things is Mow May. So can you tell me what that is? I think a lot of people may have an idea, but could you kind of spell it out for me?
Yeah, Mow May is possibly the way most people know about Plantlife as a charity. It's in its sixth year now as a biodiversity boosting campaign. And already, at the time of our talking now, there are already 55 councils across the UK, from the Highlands to the Isle of Wight, who have registered. And it's really looking as though Mow May has stronger support this year than in previous years. And the hashtag Mow May already be familiar to you, but it's Plantlife's national movement that happens annually to encourage gardeners and green space managers as well in local authorities and privately to rethink what a good lawn and what a good park looks like, and to register on Plantlife's website at plantlife.org.uk, where you can get all the guidance you need. But it challenges, if you like, that summer ritual a lot of us observe to mow lawns frequently. And instead, it invites us to be more creative in ways we can enjoy our green spaces and in ways that will save us effort and save us cost, reduce our carbon footprint, as well as, vitally, rekindle the wildlife in our little part of the world. And it's not just about stopping the mower. And for that matter, it's not just about the month of May. But Mow May is an opportunity to make a start in May, maybe before, to manage gardens and green spaces through the rest of summer in ways that are less destructive and more supportive for our wildlife. And then we can begin to be delighted with the results year on year.
You said obviously beyond May would be ideal. Does it depend on the particular site that you're looking at as to when it would be a good idea to mow it? Or is there a kind of rule of thumb, don't mow between these months?
Well, generally speaking, when people talk about wildflower meadows, we tend to think about the agricultural kind of hay meadow, which of course is traditionally the way in which food would have been grown for livestock for wintertime. And hay meadows could be harvested as early as June and probably not later than July, because that's when the hay would have been most nutritious and fully grown. But now, as urban and suburban conservation and conservation in nature reserves across the country has started to appropriate that kind of term, wildflower meadow. What a wildflower meadow can really mean is probably cutting no more than twice a year, and outside, ideally, in the majority of cases, outside of April to August inclusive. Now, that's a time window in our temperate part of the world when plants reawaken, of course, and early emergence of pollinators begins. That follows through with more insects, more flowering, seed production, and finally, yes, then there's a decline in pollinator activity towards the end of the summer. But we mustn't forget, and I'm sure there are some podcasts you've already recorded about this, that just when the butterflies stop flying, the bees stop buzzing, the day-flying moths and the hoverflies, the beetles, that whole guild of pollinators, when we don't see them airborne, doesn't mean they're not there anymore. So it's very important to think about how we can support our wildlife through winter so that it can survive and resurge into our gardens and green spaces in the next year. So really, to do that, we need to picture our lawn, our green space, as perhaps a set of zones that we manage so that, well, we strike that compromise between what they provide for us and our activity, our recreation, and what they can do to allow wildlife in and to sustain it year to year. Now, let's think of a lawn, let's say, where we want a functional part that's mown more frequently. It's perhaps mown once a week or 2 weeks, and these might be our paths. It might be a space that we need to keep neat and tidy, under some swings, around a trampoline, just where we're going to need it as a practical, functional surface, an outdoor carpet, really. But let's think about stepping outwards from that. What do we frame that with? And we could actually create and sustain a flowering lawn that we mow every 1 to 2 months. And if we can collect the cuttings, then that will create wonderful little patches of colour through the summer, naturally low-growing, perennial herbaceous plants like clovers. So we instantly start to create and sustain patches of white and red clover, and they can be complemented by the golden colours of trefoils. Then, later in the year, self-heal blues and the whites of yarrow, all of that can start to punctuate what would otherwise possibly just be a very boring green and sterile space. But that's where we need to keep things low, where we don't want things to grow too tall and encroach on our space. But how about stepping outwards and upwards from there, or at least maintaining some features which are more like wildflower meadows, cut perhaps only twice a year and outside of that ideal window, outside of April to August inclusive. And that's going to mean that we allow for taller plants to grow, for those meadow species to flower, set seed, provide seed to feed the finches that transforms our soundscape as goldfinches descend on us in September or October. But if we're mowing our meadows in September, October time, then of course we're still removing that structure which wildlife needs to survive through winter and into the next year. So if you can suffer it, perhaps along the base of a hedgerow, perhaps at the far side, at the bottom of your garden, and not necessarily just outside your kitchen window, perhaps entertain preserving a strip a couple of feet wide, if you have the space, a few meters, or a patch, which will be unmown through winter. It might still have some standing hogweed looking quite skeletal, those kind of remnants of what grew last year. But it will provide the tussocks and maybe even support anthills. All of that structure will shelter the overwintering life stages of our invertebrates. And then they can be the fluttering butterflies and the buzzing bees next year. A lot of our wildlife, such as skippers, brown butterflies, need that less disturbed grassland. And of course, you can tame it and trim it, step in there and nip off the encroaching woody growth, perhaps control bramble a little bit. It's getting a little bit too much. And this need only be around the edges. But what you've done in managing those different zones or flavors of grassland in your garden, in your lawn, is you've created spaces that complement one another. You're able to enjoy your garden. You're able to give it structure and design it, but then you're able to sustain nature as well. And of course, that will all add up. If we each do our own little bit in our gardens, then actually it can amount to a huge effort nationwide. In fact, estimates are that there are nearly 23 million gardens across the UK, accounting for some 30% of our urban areas. And the Ordnance Survey tells us that that amounts to over 500,000 hectares of space across GB. I suppose then you need to start making a few assumptions, and estimates can only be rough ones, but perhaps on the back of a brown envelope and not a white one, you could say, well, if 25%, if a quarter of our gardens is lawn, allowing for decking and driveways and patios and such like, then actually, if you were to add up all of the garden lawn across Great Britain, that would be an area larger than all the national nature reserves in England combined, and about the size of Bedfordshire. But it doesn't stop there, because government figures tell us that there are over 80,000 hectares of public urban green spaces in Great Britain. And realistically, we might consider reducing the frequency of mowing in, let's say, 25% of our public parks and gardens, then maybe only, realistically, 10% in other green spaces, such as around the edges of playing fields and maybe in the decommissioned areas of burial grounds. Then there's a study by Exeter University, and they used Google Street View, and they found that some 70,000 hectares of road verges are frequently mown and kept short. So where it's safe to do so, we could leave that to grow a little bit taller, a little bit further from the road edge on quieter, straighter stretches. And of course, this all adds up to over 200,000 hectares of Great Britain where no Mow May could make a difference, which is about the size of Nottinghamshire. So we really are talking about a county's worth of land hidden in plain sight, if you like, which is an opportunity for nature's recovery if we each do our own little bit as individuals and as local authorities.
I'm glad you brought that up, because aside from individuals, there is the question of publicly managed spaces. And you said local authorities, and I remember in my village, for example, that somebody came along and cut very wide patches of the verges, and some of it was probably not that necessary. And I did inquire, and they actually said the parish council in my instance managed the verges. So is it easy enough to get onto the correct people where if you would like to request that verges be left alone? Is it always straightforward who it is that's managing it?
Yeah, the short answer is no. Your one-stop shop will be your line of contact with your local highways authority, who have ultimate authority over the maintenance of the roads, and that extends to the road verges too. Really, the health and safety liability sits with them. So they have overriding maintenance rights, if you like. But it's not always clear who might mow a verge. It might be an adjacent landowner. It might be that that's devolved to a parish council, a town council, a district council. But obviously, safety is the highest priority. And of course, we need safe sight lines on approach to bends and junctions. we need a safe pullover zone, because in dry summers, brown grass can be a fire hazard if we pull over in an emergency with a hot lower exhaust. So we don't want to start grass fires either on the roadside. And we need to make sure that there's proper drainage for the carriageway as well. So all of those things need to be taken into account. And road verges, as marginal land, they have a lot of stakeholders. People want to dig them up to lay, underground infrastructure, water supplies, telecommunications, fiber. So everybody wants a piece of them. But on our quieter roads, perhaps where they've been surveyed for wildlife by a local conservation organisation, then in many counties there are roadside nature reserves. And they can form sometimes the last stand for wildlife in very urbanised landscapes or in intensively cultivated landscapes. And scientific research has been done to find that there's a huge value to pollinators on our road verges. And they are places where many of the last few remaining examples of old species-rich grassland can survive in some landscapes. So yes, where safety permits, they are a vital opportunity. They actually, when you add up the area of Great Britain's road verges, they come to some 260,000 hectares. That's about 1.2% of Great Britain. And that's the size of Dorset, approximately. So it really does add up as a huge scale. And you can have a bit of fun with the length of roads. If you straighten them all out and put them end to end, they'd actually stretch across Great Britain. They'd actually stretch over 400,000 kilometres, which is a greater distance than the moon ever reaches from us as it orbits us. And of course, with a verge on both sides of a road, you can tell people that, there are road verges in Great Britain that could stretch to the moon and back. And that's an important factor because, of course, that length means that road verges could act as ecologically functional corridors that could connect up the landscape, make it more permeable, especially through intensively farmed land and urban areas, so that wildlife can actually move through it as it needs to in order to cope with all those pressures we're placing on it. Loss of habitat and, for example, climate change, which is making things a lot warmer and drier further south and potentially pushing things north and west and up in altitude. So really, our linear green infrastructure, including road verges, can be a vital lifeline for nature's adaptation to climate.
That is something that actually I spoke with Dave Goulson about when I interviewed him. I'm fairly sure he said it in his book that a lot of verges are, because of their proximity to fast roads and fast moving traffic, they actually don't provide a lot of use for insects because they're on such a dangerous kind of corridor. But do you think that's the case, or do you think that there will be some collateral losses, but it is better than nothing?
There are collateral losses, and Dave absolutely knows what he's talking about there. But there are broader verges and quieter verges too. So I'm based in Lincolnshire, and a lot of the East Midlands and East Anglian counties have what are called drove roads. And before the refrigerator was invented, the way you'd get your stock or meat to market from where it had been grazing, you'd keep it alive. You'd walk it down the roads, but not on the road, but alongside the road where it could graze. So the drivers or the drovers, they would drive cattle and sheep to market and back to grazing from markets. And that's why in a lot of landscapes you have broader verges to minor roads. And that's a resource for wildlife. Plus, where you can, maybe there's a lot of disturbance from traffic, but there will be something that can still survive. And there's a mixture of opinion in the scientific literature. But what we would say from Plantlife is that there are over 700 species of wildflowers that grow on road verges, and that accounts for nearly half of the diversity of our UK flora, our plant diversity. And among that includes 87 species of plants that are actually threatened with extinction. So it's great for plant conservation, and in very many cases, it really is important for our insects, although, yes, you might expect a motorway to create vortices of air that can suck these insects out and destroy them. Well, yes, but actually there are wider verges, proportionally wider verges on the larger roads, the A roads, the trunk A roads and the motorways. So there's a bit more space, a bit further from all that pollution and disturbance where wildlife can still thrive. So it is definitely worth doing what we can.
If people wanted to protect a verge near them, you sometimes see those yellow flowers on the verges. How would one go about getting one of those, or are they handed out by local authorities, or where do they come from?
Oh, yes. So we at Plantlife, we have a website where you can download and print out signs that can explain to people, that there's a verge that's not being mown and why not, so that it doesn't reflect badly on anybody. It doesn't look like your local highways authority or your local town or parish council are being neglectful. Instead, it's being done on purpose. There's a purpose to it. And quite often that's all that's really needed. But there's also awareness. We need to increase people's understanding of the value of our marginal grassland so that we can bring back from the brink so much that we've lost, with that 97% of wildflower rich grassland lost since the 1930s. So it's a priority habitat for conservation. And in patches, small successes can be showcased, and then we can signpost those successes. And yes, there's advice on how local authorities can manage their green spaces and how gardeners can manage their lawns on our website at Plantlife, plantlife.org.uk. There are even how-to videos as well. And if you register for Mow May, you can drop your pin on the Mow map, tell us where you are by generalized postcode. Then there are identification guides on how to identify the wildflowers that you'll discover, that you've allowed to grow and flower. And you can download signs for your Mow May as well, and posters for that too, for your community, and perhaps to fend off any kind of objections from your neighbours, or at least win their acquiescence to something that looks a little less neat during certain times of the year, but is going to look so much more colourful during the height of summer.
If a lawn's looking a little bit, tatty around the edges, and maybe your neighbours are remarking on it, what can you do to make it look a little bit more intentional and a little bit more cared for, particularly if it's the time of drought, for example?
Well, framing it with a neat cut is one way to show that you haven't just walked away and been on a cruise for 6 months. But you mentioned drought and how things can really brown off. And we've had a couple of scorchers, haven't we? The dry, hot summers of 2018 and then the record breaker 2022, where a lot of our lawns browned off as grass died back and became dormant or even perished. But what people will have noticed, I'm sure, is that the broad-leaved, deeper-rooted wildflowers, herbaceous wildflowers that we often refer to as weeds, and sometimes we use selective weed killer, we vilify them, and we try to weed them out of our otherwise even turf. Well, it was those were the plants that remained green and kept flowering through the height of summer. So part of our climate adaptation as summers get hotter and drier and weather becomes less predictable is actually to nurture the daisies, the dandelions, the trefoils, the clovers, the self-heals, the yarrows, the bread and butter, what people call weeds, but really don't deserve to be weeded out, because they're going to keep your turf looking green, looking colourful, and actually perhaps a bit more respectable come our dry summers. So why not work with nature than against it? Don't try to maintain a thirsty lawn of nothing but grass, but bend a little bit with the conditions. Allow dandelions, daisies, and other common wildflowers to provide the greenery and the colour through some of our hot summers. So we're really asking your listeners to register their garden or their green space for Mow May. And then we can't wait to see what people can share with the hashtag Mow May on social media. What are the no mowers discovering? And what's happening this year? Now they're not mowing so much and not mowing all of their gardens. What's happening this year that didn't happen last year? Are they seeing something they didn't expect? Of course, we all garden in different ways if we're lucky enough to have a garden. But we can garden one way, and that might be to read the small print on the back of a packet of seeds and then only be disappointed when it doesn't come true, when things might not germinate or provide the show that we were anticipating, that lovely photograph on the front of the packet. But perhaps in some parts of your garden, those zones where we mow less often, in our lawns, for example, we might be able to create the perennial herbaceous border. We never need to weed, seed, feed, or water. And it's going to be drought resistant. It's going to keep giving through the summer into early autumn. And we can preserve some of it over winter to harbour those life stages for our small mammals, our amphibians, our reptiles, and our invertebrates, our insects, the pollinators that we'll be relying on next year. And really, if there's a way to structure your garden that creates a rewarding space where you can enjoy visiting different parts and you can have features that are low maintenance and low effort, then hopefully that enriches gardening and it creates an opportunity for nature to emerge rather than create expectations that might not be met. So let's give nature half a chance, and it will take that with both hands or 6 feet, whatever it is. And that will be something that emerges and surprises. And I guarantee you, it will be delightful. You'll see something you've never seen before, and that will happen potentially day after day through the summer and in years to come.
Thank you very much to Mark for a super informative interview, and thank you for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 108 with Dr. Lionel Smith, which was released on the 27th of July 2020 about tapestry lawns, and episode 205 with David Hedges-Gower, which was released on the 18th of September 2023 and is about lawns and lawn care. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.